There's a spare seat there. There's spare seats here. There's two. No? Okay, never mind.
Floor is very comfy.
Right. Now that everyone's here, yeah, welcome everyone to the final of Norwich IV 2026. Brilliant. So we are recording, as you can see. So again, when I ask for your introductions, please do mention if we won't be recording. But yeah, so to begin with, my name is Soumyajit. I'll be chairing this round. I'm not judging that alone, however, with me on the panel from my left.
Hi, Beth, she, her, best of luck.
I just did it, best of luck.
Hi, Aidan, good luck.
Rayaan here, there, best of luck.
Wonderful. Now, could we get our introductions from our finalists, starting with Nikhil?
Nikhil first.
Lauren second, she has.
You guys consent to voice?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Opening off.
Josh first, consent.
Cyrus Teemu Pukki
Brilliant. Closing up.
Robert.
Okay, second. And recording. Yeah. Closing off.
Ziyad first today.
Wonderful. So without further ado, on the motion, which reads, this House believes that the women of the world would be justified in pursuing a global Marxist revolution. I call the Prime Minister to the floor. Here.
Sorry.
Where did that come from?
It was, she took me and I leave for them.
Sorry.
No, it's fine, thank you.
Sound camera.
Before I start, you should seriously bring back more hard motions, I think. You can guess who the soft motion final boss is after these speeches. The first thing I'm going to say is that this is going to sound funny, it is pointless to explain what the revolution likely looks like, because it is just that it's justified that you pursue this in the first place. But I'll do this anyway. I think it likely looks like you offend structures of capitalism. You don't necessarily follow things like the reproductive norms in society and things of this sort. As a woman, you probably don't buy into the patriarchal things because these things go, like patriarchal norms, because these go hand in hand with capitalism. I'll explain why this is the case. But necessarily, as a woman, you revolt against anything that alienates you. And this is twofold. One, it looks like the capitalist system alienating you because it forces you to perform a role in which you are not able to pursue your own agency, one in which you are subjugated by the pursuit for the greater good, one that is generally dominated by men. But second, the patriarchy for similar reasons. There are two obligations that you owe to other women, and these are important. The first is to pursue a complete dismantlement of the system of oppression. The second is an obligation to support others under this system, and I think we'll satisfy both. Why necessarily does a system of capitalism subjugate women? One, because it has always favored men. It has always seen men as breadwinners. It has always pushed narratives around men being the individuals that ought to get money and things of this sort. And this has harmful implications. But second, it compounds and builds off of things like the patriarchy. There are narratives such as patriarchal norms of the breadwinner being the man. There are maternal roles that a woman must perform in a household. She must put aside 9 months of her career and a lot more time and energy in bearing a child, because these are obligations that she ought to fulfill or things that she must do in society. But third, because men should make financial decisions in the household and other narratives around this. And there are several reasons to believe that these are true, because the patriarchal system inherently favors control being in the hands of men. But this also necessarily results in financial control, which means women perform a dual role. One is of a mother, where they must spend hours and hours and days giving their time up to perform the roles of a mother, giving up their energy to perform the roles of a mother, being the more caring individual, taking care of their children, etc., while the man goes and is the supposed breadwinner. But second, I think this is the capitalistic narratives that come alongside this. In the instance that you do this, you are seen as a woman that is not independent, which just suppresses you even more and forces you to spend even more time pursuing both pursuits, which is necessarily harmful because you don't get the option to pursue your own agency. A system damns you to one of oppression. A system literally decides your agency or your role within the system for you. Crucially, this is double labor, and I think this is bad. But third, I think it pushes narratives that inherently compromise the agency of women and maximize that of men. Like the women are meant to be the caretaker within the household. They're more emotional beings. The man is stronger. These sort of things. These are generally narratives that directly oppress women. The reason that this is so bad is threefold. One is because it harms them and forces them to struggle. Because in the instance that you do not try and fulfill one, you are seen as an individual that is weak. If you do not buy into patriarchal norms, you are likely to be ostracized from these groups at large. If you don't buy into capitalistic norms and try and pursue your own independent financial success, then you are seen as a woman that is not independent, one that is dependent on her husband. And these are things that are inherently not freeing, because you don't get to make the choices that you want to make in society. You don't get to use the money the way that you want to use it, because it is in the hands of your husband, which means that the system inherently oppresses you and oppresses your agency. But second, you have to endure things, and trigger warning, sorry, I should have said this earlier. You are forced to endure things like sexual harassment in the workplace, because this is the manner in which the system allows you to struggle against it, right? You have to endure these things in the first place, because men are the ones in the positions of power, which means when you want to try and move up the system, there are things that you must face in the way. You can't complain, because that just means that you get kicked out of the system in the first place. These are harms that you must endure to be able to get any sort of mobility in your job. But it also forces women to make really, really hard decisions. Like, do I talk up about the issues that I face? Do I talk up about the toxic workplace? Do I talk about the assault I faced at my work? And I think these are all incredibly harmful, because they inherently limit your agency, but it's also just like really, really bad. It forces women to maintain their roles as mothers as well, by pressuring them based on the narratives it pursues. Closing.
What would a Marxist society look like? How is this compared?
It doesn't matter. You're justified in pursuing this pursuit, which is just offending capitalist structures. But also, I think you just, like, the revolution likely looks like you not performing the roles of either patriarchy or capitalism. I've explained why the two are intertied. I think that explains it. Second, why is this end goal not actively, why is this still good even if the end goal is not actively achieved? And there are several benefits to this. Actually, hold on, before I do that, I think the reason that this is really important and that women are justified in doing this is because of self-defense. When someone coerces you and takes your autonomy away from you and every single day forces you to live in a system where your actions are decided for you, where your struggles are not acknowledged, where you are not able to do the things that you want or stand up for yourself or fight for your own agency, you are not an individual that is acting in their own agency. You are an individual that is coerced, you are one that is suppressed. Why we think that this is justified is, like, on intuition, this is similar to every other revolution where individuals were suppressed. When the Syrians were suppressed by Bashar al-Assad, we thought it was justified for them to fight for their own freedom, because their agency was suppressed, because every single day they had to wake up and be suppressed by a government that took away their freedoms, did not allow them to pursue their everyday lives. But second, I think it inherently compromises your autonomy, and we ought to weigh autonomy quite highly in this debate, and this justifies the revolt in the face of these narratives and these systems that exist. The reason you ought to value autonomy is because this is how we make our decisions every single day every single day of our lives. But second, because you give autonomy to half the sections of society, I think for that reason you also ought to give autonomy to the other sections of society. But last, I think you ought to care about things like individual dignity, which necessarily flow out from autonomy. Why then, even if the end goal is not actively achieved, you have several benefits? Because I think in the pursuit of a Marxist revolution in itself, even if you fail in the long term to achieve a Marxist society or whatever closing opposition want to talk about, you still largely cause a large amount of disruption, and this is really, really important. Several things here. First, you cause a large amount of awareness to spark up as a result of this, because you're literally causing half the population of the world to stop the systems that run it, which means you have a large amount of shock that is immediately caused, which means you force discourse. But second, you force people in positions of power to concede to your needs. Individuals are no longer able to stay in their hoity-toity positions and be like, yeah, this is okay, we will continue perpetuating systems of oppression. They have to listen to your needs, because you wield a lot of power when you do this in the first place. You have a lot of leverage when you mobilize as a large group. But third, I think you get global attention, and this is incredibly powerful, because the world comes to a standstill in the absence of you performing the roles that you do, but their norms themselves, right? And this is how it works, because they define the norms. When you don't listen to it, their world doesn't work. I think this is really, really important, because it gives you leverage, it gives you a bargaining chip that you don't have otherwise. But last and most importantly, you create safe spaces for other women. You show them that you are there to support them, and this is really important, because they don't have anyone else to support them. And this is why you fulfill that second obligation when a system constantly oppresses you. For all those reasons, I think it's an opening up.
I thank Prime Minister for a fine speech and I call upon the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Literally.
I don't know. It changes every time. It was really bad for
I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. The first thing I want to do is to quickly explain how the debate is supposed to play out. The first thing I will note is just that we are not going to win on the clash that the existence is not one that women have in which it is justified to pursue this. We agree that the conditions women live in currently are really, really bad. We're not going to contest this. What we're going to say then is that if they pursued this, the resulting actions would be worse. What then do we think are the 3 reasons why you should not do this? The first is that it would garner a harsh response, rendering the pursuit null. Secondly, that there are better ways to achieve the change, meaning Marxism is not justified. But thirdly, that if you are successful, communism is actually worse for men. But the first thing I want to do before I get into the case is just explain why you cannot just vote for the fact that they would be justified, even in instances where they don't try to succeed or don't try to achieve this revolution. And there's 2 reasons here. Firstly, if you buy that, then you can buy that our harms, even though they would be theoretical in this case, are still bad and also therefore not worth it. But secondly, we're not going to say that they aren't oppressed, but that the way in which they would try to pursue the successful revolution, even if it doesn't actually happen, is still one which would garner negative responses, meaning it's theoretically unjust, generally speaking. First case then, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the first case is just why there are better ways to fix the problems that women face that is not a Marxist revolution. The first thing is that it's much easier to change current capitalistic structures than to meaningfully overthrow them. A few reasons for this. Firstly, oftentimes you can frame changes to capitalistic structures as being beneficial to men. So oftentimes you can frame things like maternity leave or period care as being beneficial to men because it means less money needs to be spent from men's pockets, or because if there's more maternity leave than a crowd, then it means that there's less women to have promotional opportunities for it. This means then that they're likely to put these policies in because which benefits women in ways, but they put them in because they perceive them as being beneficial to them. But secondly, it takes a lot less time and a lot less people to do it. It's very easy for a small, or not very easy, I'm not trying to live in a fake world where I'm saying it's easy for women to achieve change. It's just comparably easier, so please don't cancel me. But the thing here is just that if you work in a business that's sexist, then it's easier for the woman within that business to come together to do it, and so you need a lot less people, but you also need a lot less time. You just need people to come together and explain the experiences that they have and form these policies. But the third thing is that you can achieve some piecemeal change. Women can fight to emancipate themselves in ways that maybe they have the ability to drive, and then through the maximization of their agency, maybe they then have the ability to enter into voting systems, and then they can advocate for themselves. Maybe this does happen a lot slower, but it is able to happen, generally speaking, and means that they're able to advocate for their rights, or generally a lot more. Why is it harder to do this on Gov? The first thing is that the second this is likely to be said, and if it is as global as Nikhil says, then it creates a defensiveness in men who currently control the systems. In the West, this is likely to mean that there's an erasure of the progress that women have made, but in the non-Western world where there's huge religions and women are already structurally oppressed, it likely means an additional level of oppression, an additional level of crackdown to prevent the literature from getting to those women. But secondly, the pursuit of it is extreme, so it garners a lot of attention, which I've just said. Why are the ways we characterize easier? The first is just what I've said about less critical support, but the second is just that it takes less time, so it's easier to get small amounts of catharsis as you get many victories. So in the firm I work for, when women achieve many changes, there's ability for them to feel like they're actually meaningfully changing the condition that they work in, but also any future women who come in, and that's a positive impact, generally speaking. Why then will pursuing a Marxist revolution hurt women and fail? The first thing is that it likely garners a reaction from men and means that there's an additional level of oppression. There are 3 ways in which this happens. The first is on a governmental level. Most men and most governments are run by men, or at least have a huge majority of men in it. This means that they control the government, so they make it a lot harder for you to succeed on Gov. But secondly, they also control a lot of the ways in which allocation of budgets or the allocation of funds to women who can't afford necessities is also done. So maybe in the West you don't do this, but in the places where the right is advancing or garnering attention, or where women are already oppressed, you remove the established things that give women a degree of agency. So you remove things like funding period poverty in schools so that women have worse conditions, or they're demoralized in order to ensure that they are unable to meaningfully try to pursue this. But secondly, it happens on a personal level as well, where men don't let their wives or let their daughters engage in this system because they're worried that it's going to hurt them negatively as well. But the third thing is that now you start preemptively hedging against this garnering traction the second you start doing it. So you start cutting women off from each other. You stop allowing certain types of literature enter into schools. You don't allow or fund groups like women's networks and businesses because you're worried that if this does start to get traction, it's going to be harder to stop. So you stop preemptively cutting off against it as well. Why does it therefore mean it is unjustified? Firstly, it is an erasure of progress, where governments now stop funding things like that, where governments stop funding the progress that we have achieved in relation to things like period poverty or maternity leaves. This is an act of harm that means that the economic progress that has happened is one that is significantly reduced. But importantly, it means that you cannot achieve the outcome on Gov, but also means that you cannot advocate for yourselves in the current system, which means you're put in a much worse position than you would have been if you hadn't done or pursued this revolution. But the second thing is that the abuse and violence that is likely to result is going to be extreme towards women. Why are men likely to behave violently towards women? The first thing is just that it comes from a degree of wanting to, comes from a degree of thinking that this pursuit is unjustified, or one that is self-preservation based. Because now if these people if women want to overthrow you, you're justified in defending against that. Secondly, it could be anger. Maybe you don't think that this is a thing that is faced you, but you're likely being grouped in with these types of criticism. But the third thing is that oftentimes, and I'm sorry for how crass this mechanism is going to be, but oftentimes violence is the easiest way to demoralize people into not pursuing this. So you start behaving violently and being restrictive to ensure that people are unable to meaningfully pursue this in the first place, to ensure that it never reaches the critical mass. The implication here is that those who do engage in the pursuit of this revolution are hurt, but also they start hurting the women who do not engage in this, because now other men start preemptively protecting against this, generally speaking. The third reason this is bad, and this is just general low burden analysis, is that you start cutting women off from each other, and this means that you don't have the catharsis or the support networks that come from them. So it means that people who have experienced sexual violence in the workplace don't speak up because they don't want to be grouped with the extremism that results from this, so they don't get the things like catharsis, or the policies become stagnant or they become eroded, which means that you don't get the ability to achieve meaningful catharsis. Closing? Okay, opening.
If I fear for my life and my dignity, I can support assault me, so I shoot them. This makes the men in my village very angry. Was I principally wrong to have done this?
You may have been right in this instance, but you would not be right in that instance if it meant that all women in that community would be hurt by this. I'm willing to bite the bullet on that. Case 3, then why is communist likely worse for women? There are a few reasons. Firstly, it likely entrenches the patriarchy. For Gov to be successful, you need to convince the men who control the industry to buy, to believe you and be on your side. This means governments need to flip on their own position. You need to convince militaries, which are oftentimes hugely amounting in men, which means that when you replace it, it likely means that they are the ones in power. But secondly, communism itself promotes efficiency and what you're best at. So maybe this means men are prioritized in the physical aspect because they're likely to be stronger, or women are the only ones who have kids, so you prioritize those industries, which means that you remove the autonomy and agency because there's less ability for them to get elsewhere. But secondly, it likely means that the fruits of the labor are now, the men are the ones who are seen as being the greater levels of creating, men are the ones who are able to garner or get the results of the fruits of their labor a lot more, because the woman's work is likely seen as repetitive or not monetary, or is only seen as possible because of the fact that they result from the men. But the third thing is, and I think that this is also quite powerful, is if you do succeed in this Marxist revolution, because men control industries, this means that you are always indebted to them and all agency is removed.
I'm Leader of Opposition for a fine speech, and I call upon Deputy Prime Minister.
Panel, fundamentally, the feminist movement recognises that I will never be free until all of my sisters are free. And fundamentally, you will never be able to free all of my sisters until you free them from the shackles that are capitalism. Firstly, on the word justification. Justification is always a moral evaluation of an action where you determine whether or not an action was good. To do any sort of normative weighing, you fundamentally must be a moral actor who has made a moral decision. In order to make a moral decision, you must be an active agent. You must be somebody who has done that of your own free will and volition. You are not subject instead to the whims of determinism and consequentialism broadly. This also, panel, I will flag to you now, the ability to be an active agent is what it is to be dignified. Fundamentally then, any normative weight, anything that we say is good or bad, must be good or bad as the result of autonomy and dignity, where you've done something that I can hold in your favour or against you. This is why autonomy and dignity are important, and this is why the principle of self-defence exclusively will fulfil this. This is the case coming out of ours. At the point at which we are telling you that the action itself is what allows women to be dignified, to be autonomous, etc., we do not have to contend with the outcomes of this. We tell you that the action itself, in the moment that you take the action, the split second you decide to pursue that revolution, you are justified because that action fulfills your dignity and autonomy. Why is it then that the principle of self-defence fulfills this? Firstly, we recognise that autonomy is good for all people, allows you to be a moral agent. It is good, and we ought to let people maximise this as far as humanly possible. However, what we recognise is that if someone else, if Nikhil decides that he wants to impede upon my own autonomy, this is bad, and I have a right and a responsibility on my own self to defend against this. It is not fair that he gets to impede on mine, and I may stop him, insofar as I think it is proportionate and reasonable to do so. This is the principle of self-defence, and this is the POI that I was trying to flag. If I am a woman, and I do want to give a brief trigger warning for mentions of assault, I will try not to keep this as ungraphic as possible, but if I'm a woman who lives in a community that is generally very patriarchal, I fear every night that my husband is going to assault me and rob me of my own dignity. I shoot him. I panel was justified in that moment because of the immense level of existential fear that robbed me of my capacity to be an active individual agent. In the moment where I pulled the trigger, that is the action that is justified on the basis that he principally was undermining my own capacity to access autonomy and dignity. Panel, what happens afterwards is not what you are judging. We're not evaluating this on the things that happen beyond my own control. You must not do that because I cannot necessarily foresee that, but it doesn't matter because my fundamental autonomy as a person matters in that moment and I am defending it. The consequences of this do not matter if he is killed and the village goes, this is really terrible and I'm really sorry that he did this to you, or if all the men in the village decide that this was really terrible and forces back on me or on other women. It is the act itself of pulling the trigger that I stand behind, and I stand behind it because I have autonomy and I'm a person that deserves to be respected in that way. I'm a person who deserves to live free of the existential threat. And the case coming from OG is that capitalism is, to women, that existential threat. It is firstly an existential threat to all people because it alienates you from your labour and truly, panel, from yourself. It requires the worker continually to produce endlessly for the owner's profit. This is Robert Hale analysis, but I'm going to flesh this out further from what Nikhil said. Because the fact of the matter is you cannot opt out ever of a truly capitalistic system. It is inherently coercive. If you don't work, you don't get money through which you might purchase things like food. You then have alternatives. You might steal the food or seek to grow it yourself. But other people have the right to stop you from trying to take the things that are theirs, that they've garnered justifiably on their own. But also, in the world in which we say this is okay and only people who get to actively steal things, it's fine, I'm quite a weak person, panel. I'm a 5'5" woman who does not weigh more than 55 kilos. I'm not winning the vast majority of times that I go and fight off someone else to try and get food off them. So then I go grow things on my own land. Great, panel. This is also really expensive unless I'm growing it on someone else's land. So I now have the problem that I must either have money to buy the land or I must be once again able to fight somebody else off. You can carry this on ad nauseum. Fundamentally, you never get to opt out because you must live. You must put food in your stomach. There is no way that you escape this. And so capitalism requires you routinely to subject yourself to be a profit margin so that you yourself can live others. You as a woman, panel, historically, particularly never get to opt out. Not only is it the fact that historically you did not have access to capital, you did not have access to the workplace, to the money, to the food. This was all in the pockets of your husband. This means that not only are you somebody who is ultimately subjected to the harms of capitalism, to the harms of instrumentalism, but you also are subjected to this twice over because the patriarchy will not even give you the fundamental dignity of being the person who chooses where you take that money. Panel, you are entirely reliant on your husband because the patriarchy has said that you are subjected to him. And so not only am I alienated from myself because I must continue to work, but I'm alienated even from the person that could work because I'm one step below that still. Fundamentally, in the past, this means that women have been harmed in such a way where capitalism and the systems of patriarchy, hold hand in hand, have had a boot on women's neck, and any attempt to take this boot off is an act of self-defence that is fundamentally and principally justified. Even if it is the case that women may now access the workplace, I want to flag that one, I have flagged that this is always coercive, but women are still twice over subjugated to systems of harm. Before I go on to that, closing?
Is a rock justified in going down a hill?
The thing is, if you're going to run the case that no one is truly a free actor, there is determinism, this is fine and we'll deal with this. But in the fact that this is the case, there is justification becomes a moot point, there is no debate to be had, and fundamentally your knife and your opening that tell you ought to care about the things that happen as a result of that. Why then is it the case that we must not allow it to be sufficient for women to access capitalism and say that this is fine and this friends them? Firstly, because they, just as men, as per my previous analysis, are still victims to a system beyond themselves. But secondly, because capitalism demands labour. The warm flesh and blood that moves the plough must come from somewhere, and right now, it comes only from people who have wombs, and the vast majority of those people are women. And because the patriarchy previously told men that your job was on the factory floor and women's was in the house, not taken, sorry, the result of this is that patriarchy has acted once again to tell women that they have to do labour that men do not have to do. And the vast majority of women panel will not opt out of this. Societal norms and systems that have kept them in the home continue to keep them there. It is firstly because it is idealised and sold to us as the fairy tale ending, but it is secondly because the fact of the matter is that once you have a child, if your husband is not doing the labour, you will not let your child die. There's a biological imperative, but also because the vast majority of people can't look at their child and leave it in squalor. They deeply care about their children, and so women then are the people that are doing these double shifts. Panel, this is actively killing women. It is empirically the case that you as a woman, if you get into a long-term relationship, you will firstly earn less money, you will secondly be less satisfied, and you will thirdly literally die fucking younger from the result of the labour that you put in. Every time you go home and you cook and you clean that your husband does not have to do, every time you go home and you fulfil his sexual needs, because this is what your job was historically, it was to provide the base of Maslow's pyramid, you now must continue to provide them because society and patriarchy, as a result of capitalism dividing labour, has told you that you must continue to do this. But also, You die younger because you are literally doing this labour that no one else will do for you, and children will die. And the result of this panel is that you are being suppressed and alienated from yourself twice over. It is fundamentally the case that, as Nikhil tells you, not only are women being subjected to the horrors of capitalism broadly, not only are women subjected to the horrors that are sexual harassment in the workplace panel, it has taken us decades to convince the Supreme Court that having things like pornography up in offices is fundamentally disrespectful to women and ultimately is something that bars them from the workplace. But even once you get into the workplace panel, because we divided us separately, historically, you continue to have to do the labour that no one else will do, and it is killing women. And at the point where it kills me, it kills my sisters, and it is always going to be the most vulnerable of us that die first. Panel, I have every right to push the boot off my neck. And once it is off, I am not responsible for that. I am justified because it upholds my own dignity as a human being to remove the boot from my neck. For all those reasons, very proud.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for a fine speech and the full one deputy leader of opposition. Hear, hear.
EUDU.
We chose no water than that. Ultimately, the ends justify the means. The revolution will fail, the innocent blood and sweat of civilians will be on government's hands, and the high and mighty rhetoric of government, laudable as it may be, will mean nothing when daughters are locked away, feminist leaders are killed, and women as a group are blamed for it all for decades. Because notice the absurdity of the opening government line, because they beautifully illustrate the immensity of the patriarchy's hold on society, its subjugation of women in every aspect. But for the revolution to achieve but a shred of effect, it has to fight on all of these grounds at the same time. They describe the leverage that women have, but necessarily, in a revolution like this one, it's about whose leverage works better, as in over the long period, who eventually has to succumb to the pressures of the other group first. And by all of their explanation, it is not the men who will bend the knee first, because they have all of the institutional power to make sure that eventually you use the monopoly of violence, for instance, that you have against women, to make sure that they are the ones that eventually fold, that the revolution fails before you get there. Three things in this speech. First, a little bit more on the backlash, why it is so immense and therefore none of this ever works. Then, on why the ends justify the means, and this renders this revolution simply invalid and unjustified. And lastly, taking out the remnants of opening opposition as they exist. On the backlash, I think Josh already gives an extremely good case on why this is true, and that's why opening government tried to dodge it by saying, well, what happens afterwards isn't our responsibility insofar as in the moment of the action is justified. But I want to be even stronger here on the lasting implications too. Because there is an immense anti-Marxist sentiment that exists, and so men will find this pursuit in particular offensive and evil. Because debaters, at least in general, usually tolerate the idea of Marxism, but in most spheres, the use of the word itself is like the devil incarnate. If anyone told my Texan godfather that his daughter was participating in a global Marxist revolution, he would genuinely think that the devil himself had possessed her, that he was absolutely evil, and that whoever was propagating that image to her ought die for doing it. That is the level of feeling people have about the idea of the words like patriarchy and Marxism in the first place, insofar as all of the patriarchy that they describe is usually incongruous with the experience that men themselves have. So they always think these ideas are overblown insofar as they don't proximately experience those things in the first place. So absolutely, the idea of the sentiment is one that people really don't like, and that's alongside all of the reasons that already get out of Josh's speech. What is that backlash? We think it's threefold. That it's probably refusing to let any amount of collectivization actually happen, which eliminates their entire point on awareness. Because no, people won't be more aware of this issue insofar as any sort of collectivization that happens in schools or anywhere else will be completely eliminated insofar as the people who have the power to absolutely stop that collectivization are indeed men, like the principals of universities or the ones who own media organizations who want to hush this revolution to make sure it happens less. But far more violently than that, it also means that you persecute leadership and women. Because think about all of the rhetoric surrounding those who support, for instance, like transgenderism, which is a relatively mild ideology compared to what's actually happening here, where people actually oppose the idea of Marxism in much larger swaths of groups overall. So the right-wing response is now also paired with people who just don't like the idea of Marxism insofar as they feel personally threatened by it in the first place, which is that you do persecute leadership as people who are responsible for the ills that exist. But lastly, because you want to end the revolution as quickly as possible, because for instance, like men want to have sex, so they don't want to have this go on for too long, then they're likely to do it in the most extreme way possible insofar as to get those ends quickly, which means that they use all of their leverage really quickly to scare off other women. So you want to be extra strong against a certain feminist group leader that's propagating this theory to make sure that other people don't follow suit in the future, which means that you're doing this in the most intense ways possible. This backlash is obvious and clear. Go for it, opening.
Empirically speaking, the very first Marxist revolution came off the back of the February Women's Day March. Why is the situation right now so unlikely that women will never again achieve a revolution?
Yeah, and how did that work? Like, not very well. The whole point is that eventually it failed, and it will again for all of the reasons I just described. Also, I think the opening government model here isn't about the same revolution that they described there. So insofar as the ideology is often what's driving the backlash, I think that's consistent. Why is it then that the ends justify the means? Because opening government still have reasonable material at this point. I want you to imagine that you are kidnapped and held hostage with 5 other innocents, and the gun is pointed at you from about this distance. You would not be justified in attempting a daring escape if you were pretty damn sure it would fail. Because this is like seeing the gun pointed between your eyes and running straight at it to try to get it out of their hands. You know it won't work. Insofar as that is true, you are not justified in the action, for we have 3 reasons. 1, because of the recklessness that's involved, as in you have an obligation to consider the potential consequences of your actions, especially on others and indeed on yourself. So you do have to consider whether the action you're doing is actually going to have effects on those around you, which is why we don't like the ideas of doing things that are reckless, even if they are well-intentioned. Still, we think those actions are not justified in the same way that me running at the gun wouldn't be. But second, we do think it violates the consent of those who would be hurt by the action in the first place. So that's, for instance, all non-Marxist women who are now inculcated in this ideology and bear the brunt of the consequences in the sort of fear mechanism that I gave earlier, which also haven't consented into doing it in the first place. Like, you have no right to inculcate them in this kind of thing. But it's also like all future women who will now bear the same sort of responsibility that exists for your actions in this individual moment, and their consent was never given for you to make this decision in the first place. Those people are violated insofar as you are risking their lives, their prosperities, their hopes for future progression on this basis. But lastly, on instrumentalization, we ought not use humans as a mere means to an end. We think this is true because they are enshrined with some amount of human dignity. Insofar as even opening government exists with this, we think that using the global women as like a human shield is not an effective use of them, because they're enshrined with some amount of dignity for the same reason that if I asked you to pass assault, that would be fine, but asking you to do it while holding a gun at your head would get rid of the dignity that you have as a human. We are instrumentalizing these people insofar as we're using it for our own ideological purposes that we may or may not agree with, but fine, even if we do, it still isn't justified insofar as we don't actually get the actions and the consequences for those people that we ought get. You're instrumentalizing all women by doing this in a way that doesn't actually meaningfully improve their experience for an ideological reason that we may or may not agree with. Go for it. Closing, yeah.
Yeah, so how are any of these people going to perform this backlash when 50% of the population drags them out into the streets and seizes every bit of their property and refuses to give it back?
We don't think that they will successfully drag all of it out, and I think opening government gives some good reasons about why on an institutional level that's true, because people in power will make sure that those who have control over things like armies or the physical ownership of real estate will make sure that women can't collectivize. But it also happens on a personal level, where most societies and most families are still organized in a patriarchal kind of way. So you have the pater familias who makes sure that like the women and the daughters in his family physically cannot go outside and bars them from doing so. They can be 51% of the population, but absolutely they'd be unsuccessful in doing those kind of things because of all the reasons that opening government themselves give. Let's go through the last bits of opening government. I've already explained why the causing disruption thing doesn't work insofar as your leverage is inconsequential compared to that of men overall. But I want to lastly be clear on the self-defense point. I think we can flip this point altogether, because women need to self-preserve in order to achieve self-defense in the first place, because otherwise there is no self-defense. So consider, I can shoot my assailant if they're coming at me, and that would be self-defense. But we don't think that is necessarily justification if I can't defend myself. So if the assailant is coming at me, and I like shoot myself, and then also shoot my friend next to me, and the assailant still has nothing affecting them, clearly I haven't effectively achieved self-defense. The idea of self-defense is premised on a utilitarian calculus of whether it works or not, that it is justified in preventing the harm that was going to happen to you. It doesn't work, and opening opposition wins.
Thank Deputy Royal Commission for a fine speech, and I call upon Member of Government here.
A lot of you may have heard in earlier rounds some thought experiments about whether it is okay to live in a society that is predicated upon the eternal suffering of one person, say in some kind of pain machine, some kind of Nozikian thought experiment. I'm going to tell you something that you already know. which is that we already live inside this thought experiment, which is that the suffering of massive amounts of our society is the predication of the existence of most people across the world. I'm going to tell you something else in this speech too, which is that Marxist revolution is inevitable as a stage of history, and that the triggering event of it is going to be these women rising up, and that this will be efficacious, this will result in a complete deprivation of the ruling class of the property that they have so unjustly acquired. First, on framing. The circumstances in which the vast majority of women live are not circumstances of self-determination. They are not only denied access to property and property accumulation and wealth accumulation, but they are considered property by the societies in which they live. Their families have to pay dowries to allow other families to take them. As children, they are not fed as much as their older brothers because they're not considered as much part of the family. They're considered someone who will be sold off to some other family in the long term. They're structurally deprived of their ability to grow in the same way as others around them. They're deprived of the love that they deserve. They're deprived of their place in society. So we will support what OG fails to support. We will not be supporting small actions like opting out of the patriarchy, whatever that means. What we're going to stand behind on closing government is that women all around the world seize upon the means of production, storm the institutions, drag the individuals in charge out by the balls of their feet with vigor and with violence where necessary. Yeah, sure.
Men control literally all military aspects. The second this happens, all of the men in the military start shooting them.
Okay, blame the person who set the motion, but secondly, we're going to be proving efficacy at a later part of the speech. Because at the end of the day, because before we get into efficacy, I just want to note that when 50% of the population pursues a global revolution, that is every single member of that class. That is overwhelming numbers. That is 4.5 billion people, as compared to the members who are part of the military, which is what? That's not even a billion. That's like 200 million maximum. That's probably more like 20 million. So I just think on sheer numbers, this is going to be an overwhelming amount of society that is opting out and is likely to lead to massive structural change. Two reasons why, therefore, as a matter of fact, since you are deprived of property and considered property by society, that you are justified. First of all, it is a matter of retributive justice. The structures that oppress you deserve to be punished. The leaders who preserve these structures are complicit in the actions taken against it, which means you are justified in pursuing retributive justice against them as an end in itself, independently of whether or not you are able to achieve it. Secondly, it is necessity. You are deprived of your right to life by your deprivation of autonomy, by your inability to form your own career, to be dominated by the patriarchal societies in which you live. That means that you, on the counterfactual, are not living an autonomous life, and therefore ought to be able to be justified in pursuing any degree of autonomy insofar as the counterfactual is no autonomous life on either side, which mitigates the extent to which the backlash can even be that bad for the individuals who live in the worst off parts of society. What is a Marxist society likely to look like, and why is revolution a necessary step in history? The basis of Marxist theory, right, is the idea that over time, capital accumulation happens by the most violent and the most powerful in society. And yes, that does happen to be almost predominantly 99% men. But when the structures of ownership become so oppressive that it is a matter of historical fact that revolution is inevitable. So if we're able to prove to you that we have reached this stage of capitalism, that a revolution is inevitable, then that means that we have set the stage for the women to be largely successful. Why is it the case that we have reached this stage? It is three reasons. First of all, wealth and property accumulation have across the board, even in societies that demonize Marxism, become so severe that even the person who demonizes it as they say still reviles the inequalities of society, sees the global elite as ruling their lives and themselves being deprived of autonomy from it. The growing wealth inequality, the fact that individuals, even in the West, the most wealthy part of the world, wages have been stagnant for the working class for decades and yet have massively risen for the individuals in charge. So the anti-elite agenda, even if it doesn't bear the name of Marxism, is deeply inculcated in the pain that the working class feels every day already. Secondly, it is massive alienation from your labor. We do worse and worse things every day of our lives. We're addicted to Instagram Reels. We go into an office building where we do some bullshit on a computer with numbers that we don't understand the effect of. Which means that we are just broadly as a society unhappy. People all around the world do not feel as though they're living a meaningful life and want to pursue something else. The third is the prospect of elimination of the working class. There is an existential threat that is opposed to them right now. That is, the massive automation of working class jobs all across the world means that these individuals will be without a job and without a place in society. Secondly, the automation even of office jobs, the amelioration of artificial intelligence and the ability of this to take away their jobs also means that a tremendous amount of society over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be jobless places without any ability to function in society. And note that a huge amount of these people are likely to be women anyway, insofar as women are the most educated in society and the most likely to hold office jobs, particularly the kind of office jobs that are going to be eliminated by artificial intelligence, leaving only the elites, the ones at the top, with all the wealth at the end of the day. So, You are justified insofar as you are forced into this by the course of history. Their version of this justifying principle is like, it's reckless. But this just presumes a distinction between classes of women, right? There's the actors and the victims. But the phrasing of the motion is that every single woman opts into the possibility of death at the point at which they pursue this thing. So the moral responsibility to other women does not accrue, because all women are participating. So where they are, on the one hand, both the reckless and the victims in and of themselves. That distinction can't be drawn. But I also want to note that a tragedy may in fact be justified. That insofar as you pursue this for a noble end, it is the indication that you get as a result of that may in itself be venerated, that may in itself be considered an act of self-expression in and of itself that is denied on the other side of the house. Why are you likely to be efficacious and establish a system under which the working class owns the means of production and under which everyone is guaranteed a right to exist independently of their efficacy in a system that no longer has a role for the working class in the future? First of all, you are a huge amount of society. You can hold hostage the structures of society to a huge extent. You have, first of all, early capitulation likely because you control the family life. You control the ability of individuals to survive, to have their children not die. You also control in the West huge amounts of the functioning of your capitalist society. If women cease to work, if they storm the buildings in which they work, these things cannot function. Secondly, you have allies in positions of power, both political and financial. Never in history have women been more represented in these positions of power, and therefore their opting out as well is likely to cripple these institutions that are likely to backlash against you. The institutions that might intervene against you are likely to collapse under the mass unrest all over the world. The proximity to women that accrues even amongst these individuals at the very top. So if you're a general in the army and your wife is like, shoots you in the middle of the night, like you probably can't then get a cruise missile to come and get her, It's probably not going to happen. Fourth, the global poor will act in solidarity. The global poor live under a system of no alternatives. They live under dictatorship or whatever, which means that what the structure looks like is likely to be vastly appealing to these individuals insofar as it is a necessary stage of history. They will opt into this. They will see themselves represented in the plight, and it will be a total revolution. It will be successful.
It's fine, I won't sign it.
DCD.
Okay, cool. Starting my speech in. Oh yeah, sorry, no worries. My bad. Chat. Sorry about that. Do you have any? Oh yeah, no, about to, that's crazy. Oh yeah, hell yeah, brother. Religious freedom. Oh, I can do
only in the CV do women get to be very good.
Kula Buddha. All right. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 2 cases from closing opposition. First, why you're able to achieve meaningful reforms in other ways better than the analysis that Josh gives, which are 3 lines of nonsense. Second, I'm going to explain why why capitalism is good. What the fuck? Just do capitalism is good, you cowards. Cool. Firstly, though, I want to point out the majority of opening opposition's case is this idea that the backlash is going to be really bad. But I think the way they justify this backlash, this intuition clash on top half, you could actually just have a full debate on this, and we did, in fact. The easy way to beat this is opening government intuition pumps are if someone has a gun to your head and you do this, it's good or bad, right? But there's an implicit concession that these are only justified when you have no other forms of recourse. So obviously, if I can prove that there are legitimate other forms of recourse that are likely to work, then that is a sufficient beating of their burden. I'm going to bench way against you guys while I'm doing it, don't worry. The second thing I want to note is obviously on either side of the house, in the status quo, women are in false consciousness to whatever extent, right? So in the status quo, the governor in Alabama who passed those really restrictive abortion laws was a woman. Wow. The thing is, on either side of the house, if they're able to stand behind having all these women all get together and do grabbing them by the balls or the feet or whatever, presumably on our side of the house we can say, okay, maybe women have some breakthrough of false consciousness and push for reforms in some other ways that aren't a Marxist revolution, but maybe social democracy in Sweden. Cool. Why do these reforms actually likely to work? The first is women trivially are a massive voting bloc. There's 51% of the population, they're able to vote for policies, they're able to benefit from that. And so if they do break through this false consciousness on their side of the house, on our side of the house they say, hey, we want stuff that helps us. Second, you're able to withhold sex from your partners, and the vast majority of the time partners aren't totally evil, right? This is why, for example, women were able to push prohibition in the 1920s because they said, hey, men get really annoying when they get really drunk, so we'll stop having sex with you unless you ban alcohol. This is empirically true. Dylan knows this, so he can tell you guys in deliberation. Third thing is obviously economic participation happens, right? So you can do general strikes to push for specific reforms that are beneficial for you guys. Instead of doing general strikes to seize the means of production, you can do general strikes to have paid time off when you're pregnant. But the fourth thing I want to point out is only just talk about patriarchy existing, and this means you can't get these reforms. That's like their entire mechanism. The problem is that their calculation of patriarchy is really unnuanced, right? So the people at the top of patriarchy don't actually benefit that much from me being able to control my wife. They benefit a lot more from my wife being able to shop and buy stuff, because then they're able to make GDP go up and their profit margins go up, right? And so they actually benefit more from women having more autonomy because women will be shopping, but like in a woke way. What then do these reforms actually look like? I think a few things. The first is obviously you can push for things like paid parental leave, which is what has empirically happened in a lot of places where women are able to break through false consciousness and push for this sort of stuff. The second is obviously you get pushed for like tax benefits for having children. The third is affirmative action policies to try and remedy the disparity between women in office, etc. The fourth is you can like push for woke education, where it's like educating men about like all the cool things that women have contributed to society, or educating them about like consent, etc. to try and reduce the harm that women face. But the final thing obviously is you can prosecute sexual assault to a better extent. You can implement reforms to do that, to counteract the violence that opening government talk about. And I also want to be very clear here, right? Because oftentimes an argument that people make is that this isn't feasible because of the fact that there's wealth concentrates at the top and it never trickles down. The problem, and this is really important, is that sex isn't heritable. So like if you have really rich men and they become woke and they have daughters, they give their daughters some of that money. And so over time women do just actually uplift themselves, which is why it's different to, for example, just talking about poor people in general. It's different to talk about people of color, etc. All of this means then that you are able to push for a lot of reforms that are able to absolve yourself of the harms that opening government talk about. What are the opening opposition max here? And I'm going to be charitable. The first is they say that you're able to frame it as beneficial to men. The second is that it requires less time and people. And the third is you're able to gradually achieve piecemeal change. This is obviously far more limited in scope than the analysis that I just provided, because obviously the most important mech is that there's lots of women who are able to push for stuff on our side of the house, but also the other stuff explains this. But finally, obviously, they're more likely to be appreciative of this sort of policies, independent of anything else, because it's not a massive deviation from the status quo, and also they can't really do anything about it, because you can't send cruise missiles at women when they're just going up to the voting booth, right? Cool. Why then is it important? Sorry, the final thing I want to talk about while I'm doing this argument is on opening government stuff on the general harms within capitalist societies. And the problem here is that they don't explain why a Marxist society would be meaningfully better. And the reason why this is incredibly important is it's probably worse on their side of the house, right? Because Marxist societies are just inherently more collectivist, right? The pathos of it is this idea of from each their own ability to each their need, right? Which means if women are better at giving birth and have a comparative advantage of giving birth, they're more likely to push them into doing that. Which is why empirically in capitalist societies in status quo you have dying populations, because it's more beneficial for these capitalist economies to make women work and have them access more money, etc. because then they're able to spend that money within the economy and buy stuff that makes them happy. Cool. Why then is capitalism broadly good? The simple thesis of this is capitalism increases productivity, and this is probably the most important thing in the debate for women. The first reason for this is there's substantially more profit incentive between different private actors. So you have different private actors who have lots of money, who want to make more money. And so you do things like invest in R&D to a substantially larger extent. Obviously, centralized actors can do this to an extent as well. But the problem is that if they are less able to take diversified risks, right? Because on our side of the house, when you have a capital society, you have lots of actors who are able to do this, so you're able to have winners and losers, whereas on their side of the house, you have to preemptively pick winners and losers. Oftentimes this doesn't work. The reason why this is important is I would posit that the most influential invention in the world is the washing machine. And the reason for that is it genuinely was able to get women out of the house. Because before it made sense for women to stay at home because chores just took so fucking long that it made sense to allocate labor in this particular way. But when you're able to invent things like washing machines and better vacuums and better things that are able to allow women to do the chores that they're forced to do maybe on either side of the house faster and more efficiently, they just have more free time to do the thing that might make them happy. The second thing I want to point out is women are obviously good for the economy and good for jobs, etc. But the reason why this is important is because you also have competition between different companies to a larger extent when you're not in a Marxist society. Which means even if you don't have affirmative action policies, it's important for companies to try and make as much money as possible. And so insofar as women be competent sometimes, the companies that hire these competent women are more likely to outcompete the ones that don't. The problem is on their side of the house, you have less competition between companies, so that it's less likely to do that. If you do happen to have sex men at the top, they're more likely to consolidate power going forward in the future. Go on.
Yeah, so, okay, you're probably not inventing any new washing machines, but your entire case fails to the point to which you realize that the vast majority of women don't live in a democracy, have no claim to serve their interests.
So a lot of the other analysis I have applies in non-democratic situations, like the economic participation, stuff, etc., the sex withdrawal, etc. All this stuff also applies, but also cool. But also, even if you want to pursue a revolution in these non-democracies, you can pursue a revolution to pursue social democracy instead of what you want on your side of the house. We'll give you analysis why Marxism is probably not a good thing in general. The third thing I want to point out is that you're able to just increase productivity in general. So the previous analysis explained about competition, explained why you have innovation, but also explained why you're able to increase productivity and bring out these gains. The reason why this is important is because a lot of the policies that they would like to do to lift women out of poverty and allow them to access better lives requires a bigger pie, right? Like on our side of the house, in Marxist societies, you still have to allocate resources in a particular way. On our side of the house, where we're massively able to increase productivity through competition and better innovation, etc., you have a bigger pie to allocate to different people, which is if you want to make sure women are able to get paid maternity leave, the government has to be able to fund that. On our side of the house, you have more competition, you're able to tax more people in order to do these sorts of policies. I think capitalism is kind of cool sometimes, and I think when there are problems, you can fix it by not seizing the means of production. Just do other shit, dog. For all these reasons, Theo.
Member of opposition for a fact speech, Ms. Holden Johnson.
Before I start, just trigger warning, I will be mentioning instances of abortion and also instances of potentially sexual violence. So if you guys do not want to hear this, I'll give you a couple more seconds to exit the room. During the one-child policy in China, women were aborted before they were born. Why? Because the cost, the systematic prejudice, and the undervaluation of women was so large and so significant that it overrules literally anything. Parents were literally willing to engage in huge amounts of violence into their own body, onto their own offspring, onto the people that they should and they ought to care and love about, just because the existence of the patriarchy was so overruling and so overwhelming. Robbed gives us two things: the explanation on the necessity and inevitability of revolution, and secondarily, how you can actually achieve revolution in and of itself, which is something that OG shirks, and we're the only team that fills in this specific burden. But first of all, what does Robb explain in terms of the means, like why we can seize the means of production? I think it's relatively clear, relatively fair, but there are four big things, right? First of all, it is the fact that this is a critical mass, a large population that are able to negatively affect the idea of capitalism at a significantly large amount, right? If most of us in the room don't go to a job, and if every woman in the world engages that, it requires collectivity that can uniquely only be unlocked through Marxist revolution. Secondarily, he explains to you in most political systems there is greater representation than ever before, right? There are multiple prime ministers, which are the leaders of individual countries that are women themselves, that have some form of bargaining power, that have some form of negotiating power. If they do things like directly implement tariffs about countries that don't support them and things like that, they have some form of accountability. Third of all, he explains to you that they are likely to accrue a larger amount of buy-in onto a greater group of people that are not just women, right? The global poor acting in solidarity because they collectively all see the harm of capitalism. Most of you probably have seen the 2016 finals. He is very persuasive in the first place. But finally, we are at a tipping point in which women are unprecedented in a position of privilege, position of power. Obviously, the patriarchy still exists, but Ziyad doesn't explain why equality will continue to progress and uplift women. Here are four different reasons on why things are likely going to go downhill for now. So right now is the tipping point in which women will lose significant amounts of power. First of all, the rise in far-right means that rhetoric has been used more and more and weaponized against these women in things like stripping their rights to their own autonomy, their own body in the first place. Secondarily, US and Western isolationism means the world has become significantly more polarized. These developing nations that are significantly more conservative have significantly less access to a lot of the rights and a lot of these media and a lot of these narratives pushed by the Western world. Thirdly, China has risen significantly in power, and they are significantly more conservative as opposed to the Western state in terms of how they treat women in the first place. And fourth of all, there is a rise in the cost of living crisis all throughout the world, which means people are more likely to vote for the proximate and immediate issues as opposed to pushing and fighting for progression, trading off their own personal rights, trading off their own personal economic benefits and things like that, which means that there is greater ability to shirk accountability for all these other reasons. The problem here is that compared to opening opposition, they have two big things, right? They explain the retaliation is really, really bad, and failure is likely because men are entrenched in positions of power. But the problem, first of all, is this argument is contingent on men being so oppressive in a way in which that women have fundamentally no agency whatsoever. So because women's small actions in engaging and fighting back against men will be received with huge amounts of disproportionate harm in and of itself, which means that all of the principles still stands regardless of outcome. But secondarily, their case is precisely why small-scale systematic change, like banding together as a voting bloc, or like actively withholding sex, doesn't work in the first place, because men do things like overlook these issues because they aren't proximate. Men do things like see small actions and make small microaggressions to push down onto women even more implicitly. Men do things like not have epistemic access, so they don't understand the small harms, the small aggressions, the suppression and the restrictions of agency, because you as a man live in a world where you feel that you're in power in the first place. You don't understand how they themselves feel. So I don't see how their small actions in and of itself is unique in achieving all these outcomes in the first place. What actually does it? It is large cries of desperation. It is huge critical mass engaging in mass revolution to show people that this is the only way to create solvency. This is the only reason we can achieve all these problems in the first place. Here are 5 reasons why this is very unique in terms of achieving all this critical mass, combined with the addition of the means of production Rob has already explained to you. But before that, opening.
Women can't all telepathically decide to kill their powerful husbands on the same foggy night, so the revolution has to start somewhere. We explain the second governments and men get a whiff of this, they start cracking down exactly because they fear the massive collectivizations.
The problem here is that the revolution necessarily dictates a large critical mass starting from somewhere. And we explain that any form of critical mass in and of itself is justified and will achieve some sort of outcome for 5 different reasons. First of all, the media is unable to suppress a large amount of this because it's probably fair that most of this starts from developed countries, which means they often have more like accessibility to information, more media scrutiny, more journalists and people who are very sensitive with violence, especially against specific subgroups of minorities. Secondarily, martyrdom fans the flames even more. If an individual gets killed by trying to fight for a revolution, more people join in because you're more aware of the struggle. You're more aware this is necessary, this is inevitable, and you ought to join in right now, or else this is a critical mass you will never be able to achieve. Third of all, humans have some degree of empathy with visceral images, with visualization of suffering. So when you see women on the streets continuously get cracked down, being oppressed in a way that is so visceral and so obvious, more people are likely to opt in and engage in the revolution in the first place. And finally, people have often are somewhat compassionate to their proximate ties. Right? Most people in the world probably have some degree of interaction or some care with women in their lives, whether it be their mother, their sister, their friends, their family in and of itself. Which means that even the people who are the worst of the worst, that all wants to characterize, that will literally bomb all the women in the world, probably interact to some extent with women themselves and are going to be relatively reluctant in engaging in the crackdowns and as harmful actions as they themselves characterize, as they themselves concede. The final part of this is just the economic and social cost based upon this, which I think Rob relatively clearly and cleanly explains. We seize the means to production. We have control of the labors of our own actions. We have power in terms of how we engage in political negotiation and political leaders, which in and of itself is going to be very powerful. Finally, a bit of weighing onto our opening government. There are big cases. There's a principled justification due to an existing opportunity. But first of all, they don't explain why it reaches the threshold to inflict the harm because it's very unclear in terms of what mechanism and mean they use to achieve this harm. But Nikhil's impact also is contingent on there being some degree of power, right? You need to accrue autonomy and force concession, as worded by him. But always responsible, like, there is a disproportionate power on men, means that it is very unclear in terms of why specifically these impacts can be achieved in order to justify the principal outcome in and of itself. We are uniquely the only team that proves these women have some degree of agency, have some degree of autonomy, and have some degree of capacity to engage in large-scale revolution, to accrue all these benefits. We don't need to prove a successful revolution, but what we're able to prove is that revolution is able to lead to some change which benefits the woman. Hence, it is justified out of necessity. It is justified because this is an inevitable thing that will happen because of the late-stage idea of capitalism.
I thank Government Briggs for the fine speech and for the
we agree that the patriarchy is bad, but what we don't agree is that patriarchy and capitalism are tied hand in hand. We don't think that this is true. We don't think that people in this room, people generally on Earth, we don't think that this is something that they genuinely just believe in. Maybe you can give like several structural reasons why this is true, but we don't live in debate land. People generally don't think this is an actual thing. I'm going to prove this. Capitalism can also, but capitalism, what they fail to acknowledge is capitalism can also be woman-owned, i.e. buzzballs, women-owned businesses. They help other women, and other people also find lots of enjoyment out of this. This is a good thing. They have a good product that is bringing lots of people happiness. Maybe not great for their health, but bringing lots of people happiness, and it's women-owned, and these profits are going towards women who are supporting other women in their community by employing more women, donating to charities, these sorts of things they do all the time, and they post on social media about this constantly. This is something they failed to address. But also, they failed to address the continual change that the world has seen internationally time and time again. These changes have resulted in significant change in perception of capitalism, i.e., the simple intuition pump that I'm going to give is former colonies, when they were freed, they kept their former colonizers' institutions and infrastructures. Many of them kept their former colonizers' institutions and infrastructures because it was so hard to rebuild, but also people don't blame the origins when they have beneficial outcomes. When they see that something is benefiting them to a very great extent, they no longer care about the origins. We think that the significant change can change perceptions, i.e. perceptions can change. Like, human beings are like malleable. We have like neuroplasticity. We can change the way in which we think about things. When we think that humans have the ability to grow. We think that when humans grow, that they become different people, and our perceptions of them change. We can change our perceptions of things. This is something that we can do. But when institutions change, it's also people who are working there, their outputs, these sorts of things change, and they change the way in which we see these institutions. I.e., think of the U.S. government. The U.S. government, when they change, from the right to the left, their outputs change, the people working in government also change. We think of the U.S. government differently, and the U.S. citizens think of the U.S. government differently, depending on who is in power and what they are doing, what their outputs are. We think this applies similarly. But we think that when people see, like as Ziyad proved, when women are able to get a significant amount of power in under capitalism, and they're able to lobby for good change for women, i.e. Women are able to get like paid menstrual leave, they're able to get paid maternal care. We think this is something that's really good. When people see this change, they think of capitalism differently. We don't, but when new generations are born into this, into the narrative of seeing how capitalism has benefited women, we think that they also grow up thinking that this is different, and this eventually has a knock-on effect